Hello everybody, this is Cameron Snow with Danomics.com. So in today's video I want to talk about setting cutoffs criteria. So by the time we get to cutoff, so you've already calculated your clay volume, your TOCs, we've done our porosity calculation, we've gone through and we've done our total to effective porosity um, calculation. We've accounted for our TOC correction for dealing with organic shells. Then we've gone through and we have selected the appropriate saturation method to apply, and we've calculated our water saturation. And so now at this point, what it is we want to do is we want to flag reservoir. And generally we do this via three ways. We flag gross reservoir, net reservoir, and net pay. And the idea behind this is that, with gross reservoir, we want to flag reservoir intervals or packages based on um, just their, appearance in terms of things like sand shell. Is it a sand? Is it a shell? Is it a limestone? Is it a shell? Uh, is it an organic shell versus a gray shell? So it's a really rudimentary cutoff for that gross reservoir cutoff. Typically, that's something we'll do just using our clay volume. Then we want to do a net reservoir cutoff. So, a gross reservoir could be a sand that is completely cemented up and has no porosity. Well, net reservoir applies a porosity criteria. Then you have to have a sand or a reservoir package that is uh, less than a certain percent clay and greater than a certain percentage porosity. And then, so that tells us, or at least it's a very good proxy for what flows, what does not flow versus what will flow, right? So if you think about a gross reservoir, there's no guarantee that it will flow either oil, gas, or water. If you look at net reservoir should flow whatever the pore filling fluid is. So if it's a 100% water saturated interval, it should flow water. If it's a oil saturated interval, it should flow oil. Uh, then we apply a saturation cutoff, and this is what we call net pay. And if something is flagged as net pay, it should flow hydrocarbons. So, how do we go about setting these criteria? So, here we have some logs pulled up, and I'm just going to zoom in here to the Niobrara Formation. So, in this particular area, we are quite a bit distal. So this is a relatively high clay portion of the Niobrara. Um, you know, which we can see pretty readily from looking at the neutron density. It is an organic shell, which we can tell from looking at the gamma ray. We see that hot gamma ray signature. And this means that it is typically quite low effective porosities across this interval. So, if we were looking at this, now the question would be, what are the correct cutoff values? This is, although that seems like an easy question, a lot of times you'll hear people give blanket answers like, your V clay cutoff should be 35%, your porosity cutoff should be, if it's an organic shell, maybe it's 4%. If it's a conventional sand, maybe it should be 8%. Your saturation cutoff should be 60 or 65%. Now, those aren't necessarily bad values, but those are just values that are based on conventional wisdom. And, we like to try to calibrate things when we're flagging things. So for a minute, I just want to talk about how can we calibrate net pay or net reservoir as a calculation. So the first thing you could do is, maybe you've drilled your well. You could go through and do a number of flow tests at different intervals. Maybe you see an interval that looks interesting. if you've already cased your well, you could perf that interval and try to see what happens if you flow it. If it's an open hole, you could do a DST, and see if that interval will flow. Even you could even try and take an RFT or MDT measurement on that. So if you're able to draw down some fluid there on that, then it may be capable of flow. So that's one way we could try to establish, maybe what our clay cutoff should be, maybe what our porosity cutoff should be. For the saturation, of course, if you take core, you can look at the relative permeabilities. You could establish, where your irreducible water saturation is, and at what saturation you need to be at for the to be able to flow oil. Looking at your relative permeability curves, that's one way you could do it. You could, if you were just doing a basic core analysis program, you could go through and look at your trend of porosity versus permeability, and try to establish at what porosity levels your permeability approaches zero, and therefore you'd be unable to effectively flow the rocks. For something like clay volume, if you're looking to frack the reservoir interval, you might say that you need to be below a certain clay volume in order for the rock to be brittle enough to be able to initiate a frack effectively. So there's a number of ways we can think about it that way. One of the things that I like to do, if possible, is to go out there and get a PLT log and really understand what intervals are contributing versus which intervals are not. That's always one way to do it. But really what you need to do is you need to pay attention to the testing. If a zone flows either oil or water in a meaningful quantity, and we'll come back to the term meaningful, then that means it should be net reservoir. If that rock flows all water, then and no hydrocarbon, that should be net reservoir, and it should definitely not be net pay, regardless of what your log calculations are telling you. If it flows net pay, or if it flows some hydrocarbons, and this is where cutoffs start to become tricky. So it might be very easy to imagine, part of this interval in the Niobrara flowing a small amount of hydrocarbon. Let's say it flows a couple hundred MCF a day, or a couple of barrels of oil per day. Does that mean that there's net pay there? Well, it means that interval is capable of flowing hydrocarbon. So if your definition of net pay is that it flows any hydrocarbon, then yes, it's net pay. However, what if it flows 99% water, and your water handling costs are quite high? Then is that interval net pay or not? Well, that a bit depends on the oil price. If oil was at a quite high price, then maybe a couple of barrels per day is enough to make that economic, even with the cost of handling water. Whereas if the cost of handling water is quite high and the price of oil is quite low, then that same interval may be uneconomic. And so this leads into the debate of whether or not net pay should be a dynamic property. Is net pay something that changes through time based on the economic situation? And I would argue that that we need to be pragmatic, and that the answer is both yes and no. So one, as a petrophysicist, it is our job to do two things. One, we want to determine if an interval is capable of flowing hydrocarbons. And, it's important that we flag that, we make a note of that, and that we uh, store that knowledge somewhere. And the reason this is important is, either later in well life or, as the price of oil increases or the cost of handling water potentially, or our ability to produce gas changes, we may want to go back and recomplete the well to that interval, in which case that would be net pay. And it's very important that we have a record of that. However, also as a petrophysicist, it is our job to help determine if an interval can be economically produced. And so if the answer is yes, that it flows oil, but it's 1% oil and 99% water, and the volume of oil is not enough to support the disposal of all that water, or the expected volume of oil is not enough to um, support the decision to run casing in a well, and then, in that case, we need to flag it as having the potential to flow hydrocarbons, but we probably also need to make it clear that that is not net pay, in the sense that, it will, make us a profit on this well or for the company. So, that is one of the debates. When it comes to setting cutoffs, you know, you'll hear a lot of conventional wisdom um, out there about how you need to set it. And, cutoffs to people are a lot like religion and politics. They are quite personal, and they can really get your petrophysicist or your geologist, into a quite heated discussion if your belief system is different than theirs. Um, so it's really best to go in and try to establish those in a meaningful way, and to support that with measurements when possible. As far as the mechanics go, it's quite simple. Different programs do this in different ways, but for this one, I just want to show you. So, like, we're looking at the Niobrara. Let's say we believe that we can frack relatively high clay volumes in the Niobrara. So let's say I believe we can frack 45% clay. When I do that, now I can see that I have a significant additional gross reservoir here. Let's say that I think that I only need a total porosity of greater than or equal to 0.4%, and we need to meet our gross reservoir criteria. So once again, now we'll see that we expand out this definition a little bit more. And then finally, what is the cutoff for saturation? 60% is probably a little bit harsh, probably 65% is a bit more of a realistic cutoff in this. But what we see in this well is that we really, the way we have calculated saturation, there's very little of this interval that has less than 65% saturation. And then, as a kind of another stylistic choice, we need to decide, what about these very thin intervals? Do we want to get rid of intervals less than a certain minimum thickness? You can certainly do that, to try and clean up what your log looks like. What should that zone be? Should it be 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot? Once again, it's kind of personal choice and depends on what your economic thresholds are. But in general, that is how you set cutoffs. Um, some questions you should ask when setting cutoffs. These should be set zone by zone. Um, you know, things, your ability to flow is going to be based not just on things like clay volume and porosity and saturation, but it's also going to be affected by facies, which is a product of rock type, etc. So, you could maybe have one set of cutoffs for organic shales, another set of cutoffs for tight sands, another set of cutoffs for conventional sands, another set of cutoffs for limestones and dolomites, etc. And maybe it's going to be more complex criteria. Maybe it's going to be a combination of you have to have certain criteria in terms of your clay volume or your TOC and your effective porosity. And really, you can get as creative as you want to with this in most softwares. Certainly in our software, you can do that. Um, so, and it doesn't have to be an interpretive value. Maybe you don't feel comfortable with your saturation calculation. Maybe you just want to apply a resistivity cutoff. Definitely some people do that, especially if they're uncalibrated when they're performing this analysis. So, a lot of different ways you can kind of slice this. But at the end of the day, you need to listen to what the real ground truth is, and that real ground truth is production. So, if you told me that you drilled this well and you went in and fracked this interval and it didn't flow, I would say we need to adjust our criteria to get rid of this net reservoir flag. If you came in and you told me that it flowed all water, I'd say, maybe we did a pretty good job. If you told me that it flowed commercial quantities of oil and gas, I would say, well, we need to revisit our saturation model and update that accordingly so that we can put some net pay into this well. So I know this is kind of a long video and there's not been a lot of action on the screen. It's been more, just me verbalizing, some of the considerations when calculating gross reservoir, and net pay. And this is something that you will gain a feeling for as you work more projects, uh, as you look at more wells, look at more production tests. You'll start to develop a sense for what can produce. But what I will say though is like when it comes to setting these, a lot of times, you know, you don't need to over science this. If you're looking at clean sands, a lot of times, all your sands are less than 5 or 10% clay volume, and all your shales are at 20, 30, 40, 50% clay volume. So you can very easily go in and set a clay volume cutoff at 30% and be perfectly happy. A lot of times, especially if you're looking at conventional sands, your sands are 15, 20% porosity, and your shales have very, very low effective porosity. So, a lot of times that becomes a very clear cutoff where the difference between setting it at 6%, 8%, or 10% is quite small. With saturation, as we get to saturations greater than 65 or 70%, we start to get to a point on the relative permeability curves where you wouldn't expect to flow, oil or gas in substantial quantities, once we get to water saturations that are above, let's say, 65 or 70%. So, that is kind of where those cutoffs come into play, is that's kind of a proxy for a very generic relative permeability curve. Now, with that said, that can vary quite a bit depending on the charge history of a rock, and whether or not a system is potentially leaked or not. So there are times when that saturation could be either a higher or a lower cutoff. So, just keep that in mind, and feel free to experiment with cutoff values to try and work out some sensitivities. See if, given the production profiles, if 4%, 6%, 8% porosity, makes a meaningful change in, what your expected recovery factors would be. So there's a lot of ways you can test this. And a lot of times it's not a clear-cut answer. Like I was saying, there is a debate on whether or not net pay should be a dynamic property that's based on, economics. So maybe what's paid for one company is nothing to another company. So, you just need to think about your own company scenario when you're doing that. Okay, well, that is it for this video. It's probably been a bit different than some of the other videos. There wasn't as much going on, um, but I hope it was still useful to you nonetheless. So that is it, and we'll be releasing more videos in short order. So I hope this was useful, and thank you. Goodbye.